podcast on journalists and journalism. My name is Krishna Prasad, and we've been doing the series of podcasts in the season of the coronavirus, essentially to draw attention to the plight of Indian journalists and journalism, especially print journalism, in the thanks to the coronavirus and all the issues that it has thrown up, the challenges it has thrown up in terms of salary cuts and job cuts and so on and so forth, especially for print media in particular. Joining me today is Gurbir Singh, the president of the Bombay Press Club, the Mumbai Press Club, a veteran journalist, a long-time employee of Business World magazine, and currently a columnist with the New Indian Express. Gurbir has been a pretty vociferous proponent of the rights of journalists in newspapers and magazines and TV stations. And Gurbir has been leading the charge as the head of Mumbai Press Club in taking on some of the issues that have cropped up in the last couple of weeks. Bombay Press Club has actually issued a very stern warning to newspaper managements to desist from, taking off employees, from cutting salaries, etc., etc. And on top of that, there have been a number of other unions and journalist bodies, the Bruhan Mumbai Union of Journalists, for example, the National Alliance of Journalists, for example, who have gone to the Supreme Court of the PIL. So what has happened in the last week, especially, has been a very clear blowback from journalists unions and bodies of journalists, opposing the summary dismissal of employees, the salary cuts which have come suddenly, and so on. So Gurbir is now joining us from Bombay. And Gurbir, thank you very much for joining me on this episode of JPod. It's great to see you and talk to you. And first up, what do you make of what is happening all around us just now?
Um, well, you see, there is a definite crisis which industry as a whole is facing, and media companies specifically are facing more than other industrial units. The fact is that advertising is near zero. The main revenue of media companies which comes in is very poor right now because advertisers have nothing to advertise. There is no momentum in the market. Secondly, distribution of newspapers, the print side is completely frozen. A lot of cities are seeing very little actual physical distribution. Because of that, again, advertising is being hit. So yes, there
Yeah.
is a very, very definite crisis which media companies are facing today, and they have to ponder about how to face it. The answer should not be uh, reducing, cutting staff, closing departments, sacking people. It should not be at this stage. Uh,
Right.
the two facts are that the Information and Broadcasting Ministry has specifically appealed on 20th March to industries across the board not to let go of their labor at this crucial, challenging time when they need the support of the employers the maximum. A
Right.
few days ago, the Prime Minister himself, on his appeal number 6, he had made seven appeals. Appeal
Yes.
number 6 was specifically that that the employer should not let go of his employees, look after them in this period of crisis. Now, you see, the ethical part of it is that employees, workers, journalists who have been part of your establishment, helped you make your profit so far, got your company to where it is now, uh,
Yes.
are the people who you should take their loyalty as something given and look after them when there is
Right.
a crisis period going on and not let go of them. That is the ethical part. So obviously
Yeah.
there's a huge violation of that going on.
Yeah.
uh, the second part is the legal part. Legally, there is a process, there's a due diligence process by which people can be retrenched or terminated. These are not being followed.
Hmm.
For instance, Section 25O of the Industrial Disputes Act
Yeah.
prescribes that if you have more than 100 employees, you have to
Yes.
take government permission before you
Yeah.
let people go. And now
Yes.
that's not being done across the board.
Yeah.
Now, ignoring both legal and ethical compulsions, what is happening is media companies across the board have used this as an opportunity to let go of their, or to rather sort of trim down and
Yes.
to sort of reduce their expenses, reduce their costs by sacking journalists, by sacking non-working journalist members of their fraternity, and trying to sort of reduce their costs in that way.
Correct.
This is not the time to do it.
Yes.
It's clearly the wrong time. People are facing huge challenges. Uh, People don't find jobs easily anyway. In this time, it is going to be even more serious.
Yes.
So this is the time they should have actually looked after their employees, and if necessary, take a review when the
Mm.
things open out, when the whole health issues around coronavirus open out, we are back to normal. At that time, one can take a sort of look at what is the level of staffing and all these things, and take a decision at that stage.
Right.
But here you see a very sort of opportunist way of doing things, because it's given, there's a ready-made excuse out hand
Yes.
that this is the time. I mean, that our revenues are down, we cannot afford the excess staff, etc. So we want to, downsize. It becomes very easy to do that.
What is your information? Which newspaper groups across the country have done what you're saying? Which magazine groups? Which TV groups? Do you have a list? Do you have a number of what has happened?
So there are at least I would say 20 of the smaller groups have actually either shut down completely. Like there's a small group called the Hamara Mahanagar group which has shut down. There are others which have not shut down entirely, but they have sort of downsized, and they've sort of stopped departments or supplements which they find which are not necessary. For instance, the Sunday magazine has been, about five or six staff of the Times of India group. They have
Yes.
sort of cut off that department. The ET Panache used to be an 8-page supplement with the Economic Times that has been rolled into a one-pager at
Right.
the back.
Right.
Um, Similarly, Bombay Times, which used to be again an 8-page supplement, is barely 2 pages today.
Right.
So, these are, so there is both a kind of combination of closing departments, and in some places completely cutting them off. In the case of, say, Bloomberg Quint, they have about 50% of 16 or 18 staff members have been asked to go. Others
Yeah.
have taken salary cuts. In the
Yes.
case of Indian Express North, it is basically salary cuts between 30% and 50%.
Right.
Again, Business Standard has done the same thing, salary cuts of different slabs, depending on how much you're earning. On a ratio of that, salary cuts have been ordered. So there are different ways on which media companies have gone about doing that.
Yes.
There are a couple of news channels which have completely shut down.
I
Um,
see.
there is a star of Mysore, or star of a company of that name has shut down completely. Now,
No.
so about 16 or 20 companies have actually shut down completely. Another
Right.
8 or 10 have sort of trimmed down their departments, and a whole host of the bigger ones are actually preparing their cull lists.
I
It
see.
is known, for instance, from the HR departments of Times of India, from HT, from India Today, also from the Reliance Group, which is
Right.
publications like Forbes, etc. The print side has already been shut.
Yes.
Even on the digital side, they're looking at trimming down further.
Right.
So these cull lists are being prepared. They're probably testing the environment, whether the government would allow it, whether the social, the social conscience of civil society would allow it, and then they'll
Mm.
probably take a call on that. So it,
Yeah, just a small clarification. Star of Mysore is something I'm very close to because it's near my house. Star of Mysore has not yet closed down. It will not close down. It's a very profitable newspaper. What they have
okay,
done is they have suspended publication for a
okay,
duration because of a range of issues, but certainly because of coronavirus.
okay.
But to come back to the key question,
Mm,
uh, we are now only hearing of journalists being let go of. At least
mm,
that is what concerns our minds. Do
yeah.
you know of managers who've been let go of by these companies? Do you know of non journalists being let go?
Yes, a lot of them. In my old publication, Business World, for instance, the about 50% of the distribution staff,
I
some
see.
of them just rang me up yesterday,
Uh-huh.
and they were saying that many of the distribution people have been let go of, and they've actually cut down on physical distribution, more turning towards digital platforms and digital distribution. So that's another trend. Some people are trying to meet the crisis by changing over more to a digital kind of format,
Right.
but at the same time, they don't know how to tackle the situation. Some of them are furloughing them, giving them permanent furloughs or temporary furloughs. Some of them telling them that we'll call you back when things are a little better. So different kinds of arguments. So
It's
across the board, for the ratio of number of journalists and non-journalists is about the same.
I
If
see.
in fact, I think in many cases the non-journalist staff tend to be cracked down upon faster and earlier than the
Hmm.
journalist staff, which is the case in I think that was the case in Scroll. In
I,
Scroll, first a lot of the non-journalist staff were let go of, and now later on some of the desk and other journalist staffers have also been let go of.
is that post this coronavirus thing or before?
This in the case of Scroll, I think it was before,
Right.
but
Right.
post the pandemic, there have been a number of cases where the non-journalist staff has been asked to go also. Yes.
Right. I think one of the really interesting things concerning employee relations in this period has been the introductory word furlough, a
Mm,
very British sounding word, which is
mm,
suddenly popped into our lexicon. It
mm,
basically means leave without pay,
yeah,
and really, one of the things that strikes me, because Bloomberg Quint is one of those which has actually formalized the use of the word furlough, where
mm,
it asked 50% of its staff to stop coming to work suddenly, with just a
yeah,
48-hour notice, and said you go with, take leave without pay.
mm,
I mean, it really struck me as to how insecure and unsafe the environment is for journalists. And
yeah,
it's quite bizarre that newspapers, which should be really speaking up for greater employee relations and greater employee safety, social welfare nets, etc. It's the newspapers and media houses which seem to be leading this charge, where employees have nearly no job security of any kind. you know
yeah.
you, as someone who's been at the helm of all this for so long, how do you look at the situation where we've become such a dispensable part of a media organization?
You see, what's happened, and I've closely followed this, is you see what's happened specifically with the journalist community is that in the last 2 decades or little more than that, there's
Right.
been a gradual shift from regular employment to contract employment.
Right.
So in the late 80s and the early 90s, there was a lot of unionization in companies like the Times of India, also Indian Express, where the journalists were not only part of the union but also fairly active and in the forefront of various union battles, which included questions of modernization, salary issues, etc. And by and large, journalists used to come under the Working Journalist Act, and they used to be covered by the wage boards, which every 10 years or 12 years a wage board would come in and sort of review the wages.
Right.
Now, to get rid of that process, the Times of India around the late 80s started this process of turning journalists into contract employees, where they would not take the normal route of what a contract workman did, which is to give him less salary but give him more. So
Yes.
what happened was it started at about 20-25% more than wage board salaries, but it went up to 100, 120, and even 200 and 300% more than the wage board salaries. So this was a
Right.
real attraction, and large numbers of journalists shifted to a contractual kind of system.
Right.
I used to be in Economic Times that time, and everybody, including myself, also shifted in the late 90s. I shifted in the first part of 2000, etc. Now, what this meant was that, and it became, at some stage, it became impossible to remain within the, there was no choice. If you wanted to continue with in employment with these companies, you had to take a contractual, you had to sort of sign a contract with these companies. Now,
Right.
this effectively reduced bargaining power of
Right.
the journalists.
Yes.
Some of the non-journalist employees continued with the unions, but
Right.
those unions also became weak because the journalists were not part of the union at that time.
Right.
So this has sort of continued, and
Right.
what has happened over the period, what we are seeing the net result of it today, is
Yes.
that you see, when today Times of India as well as HT are announcing reduction in salaries, actual reduction in salaries by transferring their fixed salary components to variable, which means
Right.
actually they'll never see the variable. They
Yeah.
may be coming back to probably wage board levels, many of these journalists.
Right.
But
Right.
not only the salaries being reduced, maybe something below wage board, but their bargaining power is also been lost.
Right.
So you have a peculiar situation now. So you're not unionized,
Yeah.
your salaries are falling, and when this kind of hatchet falls on your head,
Right.
there's nothing you can do because there's no union to defend you.
Yeah.
And that entire culture of collectively fighting, uh, you know, fighting management is gone. For the last
Right.
20 years, 25 years, journalists are not used to it. So journalists have fought on issues which concern ethics, journalist rights, media rights, and all that. But when it comes to bargaining power, they have majorly lost out in this period.
Yes.
And
No.
now you're facing a situation where, you know, people are looking around, wondering what to do, whether they individually contact lawyers or they just take a 1 month severance pay or something like that, bargain for 3 months, things like that. So to put it in a word, collective bargaining, which was the culture and the practice about 30 years ago, has been lost, and journalists being not collectively organized are really facing a difficult situation where their individual voices are very difficult to be heard.
Hmm. One of the heartening things, of course, in the last couple of weeks has been at least some noise coming out of the unions, such as they are. I know that the unions are vastly weakened, etc., but at least one is hearing something from DUJ, BUJ, NAG, etc., etc. And you yourself, the Mumbai Press Club, has also, issued a very stern warning. I saw, and I was quite happy to read that statement. You know, you as a journalist who has also been a trade union kind of guy on the one hand, also the member of the president of the press club on the other hand, you are also aware, especially as a business journalist, you are aware of the tensions being faced by the newspaper industry on the whole. You know of the digital challenge, you know of the current problems, you know all of that. Yet I saw that in the Mumbai Press Club statement on this issue, you have said that newspapers and managements which chop and change at this time should be blacklisted. Why did you say that when you're very aware of the situation? Why did you feel that this was something to be said?
I think it's a question of it's a question of these companies should sort of play clean. It You can't have the cake and eat it too. So you
Hmm.
have a whole bunch of these companies who are illegally terminating journalists. I mean, who are not sort of paying heed to the national advisory being put out by the Prime Minister, by the Information and Broadcasting Ministry, etc.
Yeah.
And yet they want to be eligible for the handouts and
Yeah.
other waivers that are being considered to help industry
Correct.
out. I
Correct.
mean, specifically, they are seeking waiver of 5% customs duty on newsprint. They're seeking 2 years tax
Tax
holiday
law.
on newspaper establishment, 50% increase in advertising rate of government ads, all these kind of extra concessions. But
Hmm.
then they have to play both sides of the paper. I mean, they've got to also look after their employees and see that they also come through this challenge without being completely pushed under. So they're
Correct.
not doing that part of the bargain. So that is why specifically the Mumbai Press Club felt that these concessions should only be available to those companies who are playing it clean, who are also looking after their employees, and who also have a kind of uh, you know they have an ethical streak and an ethical wisdom to sort of to go after.
Hmm. But what we've noticed is, of course, the opposite. It's as if the newspapers, are in a different universe. They're just able to go ahead with these things. One of the things that also strikes me is that many of these moves had been made by companies which are actually now owned by journalists. Which is the bizarre part.
Mm.
Some of these companies which have let go of people or cut salaries, they're run by journalists who should know better. It doesn't seem to be the case. It just seems to be that journalists are no better than managements in some of these aspects.
So I suppose many of those people you refer to, I mean, these were journalists formerly, but they're entrepreneurs now. I mean, a person like Raghav Bell is more entrepreneur, though of course he's a journalist also.
Yeah.
A person like Pranoy Roy, he's more entrepreneur, and he's also journalist, but he's less journalist. So they're clearly their bread is buttered on the entrepreneurial side more than on the journalist side. So I
Hmm.
think when it comes to thinking and planning,
Hmm.
it works that way. But it's also very interesting that many of them have already in the past, and this is important, they've already done their cleaning out of their companies. For instance,
Yes.
NDTV
Yeah.
had a staff strength of something like 900 at
Hmm.
peak. I'm
Yes.
talking of many years ago.
Hmm.
And now they've reduced it to probably less than 300 today. And
Hmm.
and earlier on, NDTV had an approach where they didn't want to hurt uh, their staff, etc. But then they took a so-called pragmatic attitude, and I mean, they were suffering from years of not making any profit. I mean, a single operational year of profit was evading them for many years.
Hmm.
And finally, they cut down and they followed the normal processes. And much before COVID and coronavirus came onto the scene, they'd already cut down to a very efficient, so-called efficient level. And in
Hmm.
the last 2 years, they've actually made operational profits.
Hmm.
So they've
Hmm.
cleaned out. So I'm just
Yeah.
giving you an example. It's so some of the more prudent entrepreneur journalists have done this.
Yes.
Uh, Raghav Bell and Network 18 has also followed this process
Yes.
of unproductive or unprofitable areas being cut off, etc.
Hmm.
Uh, Many like Forbes, the print side did not succeed, so they closed that down.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
all that has happened.
Hmm.
The point is, after all this cleaning, where does this further chopping and cleaning come in from? Why can't they wait for a couple of months to see
Hmm.
how the scenario is after this?
So
You know?
essentially, you're saying this is pretty premeditated, that they just wanted to do this, that they've seized this opportunity to do this, right?
Yeah. So there may be a few small companies who, as it is sinking and all that, who couldn't take this anymore.
Hmm.
There are a few companies like that.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
But some of the bigger ones who have got a cushion, who've got some cash flow, who's sitting on a pile of cash, I'm sure they
Hmm.
can ride it out. I mean, Times of
Hmm.
India at this stage doesn't need to cut and chop. They
Hmm.
can wait for a couple of months.
Yeah.
So it's clearly opportunistic, as I said earlier, that they're
Right.
using this current crisis
Hmm.
uh, people are looking the other way, people are busy with other things. So I mean, it's possibly an internal thinking that nobody will notice all this happening.
Yes. Yes. Is this
So
also
they're
possible?
using it.
Is it also
Sorry.
possible that the newspaper managements and TV managements do not see a very bright future in the sense of revenues and profits, and therefore they are preparing for that? Do they just
You
feel the
see,
bad
the
news?
industry is changing, but KP, the industry is changing. But look at it this way: have you ever seen any phase of history in the last 30, 40 years where news has become so important? I remember I used to do these statistics, say for at least for broadcast,
Hmm.
the eyeballs commanded by news channel was used to vary between 8 and 11%, and
Hmm.
entertainment used to be typically 55, 60%
Yeah.
of eyeballs commanded. I mean, just very sort of thumb rule kind of thing. It changed every month a little bit, but it would vary between that.
Yeah.
Today, I would say news channels and news outlets would probably command about 60, 70% of the eyeballs, and entertainment and everything else would be 30, 35%.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
I mean, the challenge before them is how to monetize it. Eyeballs are there, interest in news is there. So
Yeah.
why should they not be, sort of cashing in on that? There are distribution problems that
Yeah.
can be sorted out, but we are in a new world where people are hungry to know what's going on. There's a hunger
Yes.
for information and communication. So,
Yes.
how are they working to monetize this sudden kind of huge kind of demand for news and information? Why are they not doing that? It's these are all relative things. Whether revenue is going down, yes, advertising revenue is going down. So why can we find other ways of doing it? And advertising revenue will come back. I mean, ultimately, when the companies come back into play and the production lines start again, those companies will need to advertise very strongly so that their products can jump back into business. So
Correct.
can they not cash in at that stage?
Yeah.
It's just a question of holding out for 2, 3 months. This is not going to last forever.
Yeah, that really is the real paradox of this situation, where at a point of time when managements need to be investing in some kind of expertise in terms of serious journalism, they are basically hollowing out the profession. In a manner of speaking, they are really taking the nucleus out of the profession.
Yeah, yeah. And that's true because you see how they're looking at it also is it's literally like I know companies how they're doing it is they're just spotting who the who the sort of more senior, higher earning people are. They're literally making lists like that.
Yes.
Putting red mark, green mark on the basis of how much salary drawn, how senior is that person, and if we get rid of him, we can get three other guys at a much cheaper rate, kind of thing.
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
that kind of thinking. I don't want to name people, but literally, editors or senior editors are being identified like that. This guy is drawing so much, and if we get rid of him, we are saving so much.
Yeah.
So what the guy's contribution has been, or what he can contribute in the future in terms
Yeah.
of boosting the business, all that is not being factored in. So it's a very short-term thing which can only end in disaster. Because if you think like this,
Yes.
you're not going to be able to, uh, live out the brave new world which is going to come after this pandemic is over.
Very well said. Because actually, I can add to that. I know of a leading regional language media group which is actually unbelievably let go of people, all people who had a CTC of rupees 50,000 and more per month. Unbelievably. I mean, it's as if the newspapers do not want any kind of institutional memory. It's just as if, cheaper seats is all that counts. So
Yeah,
therefore, they've just let go of anybody who has a CTC of 50,000 or more. And I find that
yeah,
really baffling, troubling, in the sense that
yeah,
if journalism has to survive, it needs good journalists, experienced journalists, it needs people who know the business. It seems to be that as if newspaper managements just seem to think that the only thing we are worried about is what sells and what does not sell. You know, so
yeah.
if it sells, we will retain you. If it does not sell, you're off.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. No,
That
but
that and it's sort of it's also feeling that what does the journalist know more than what I know. or
Yeah.
what the managers know. So, I mean, it's a question of editing skills which can be got anytime.
Yeah.
The kind of the aspect of being able to what goes into news collection, into news analysis,
Yeah.
and into targeting specific audiences with certain types of news. Now, that is all, these are all very important skills which don't come overnight. I mean, these are sort of honed through the years. And this is something which has been completely given the go by.
Yeah,
So,
but you, of course, you and I speak as old school journalists. I think what modern media wants is people who can create memes, who can give a nice caption or a catch clickbait headline. So I think managements are looking in that direction rather than in our direction. You know,
yeah, and a
they're
lot of
looking.
it is processed news, which is available off the shelf.
Yeah.
And how we're thinking is that as long as you have the distribution and you have a network of subscribers within your system,
Yeah.
what you put out is not, ultimately they are addicted to you, so you put it out and they gobble it up.
Hmm.
So it's all the short-term thing. You see, ultimately all these things will crack up sooner or later.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
uh, you know Times and many of the old sort of big groups are seeing that it's sort of hurting them over time.
Mhm. As we wind down into the last couple of questions, what action do you foresee coming from the interventions of Mumbai Press Club or the Bombay Union of Journalists or the Delhi Union? What action do you foresee coming, or even with the PIL in the Supreme Court?
See, I'm hoping that somewhere that you see the these are sort of warning actions in the sense that telling the companies that don't think that your whatever you're planning or whatever you're sort of cracking down on is being sort of ignored. It's being watched very closely. So it's to alert them that look, it's not going to go unchallenged. So that's the first thing. So those who are thinking of chopping and cleaning in this phase of the crisis
Hmm.
should actually postpone it because there will be consequences.
Hmm.
For whatever reason, the government, which normally does not act on issues of labor or in defense of labor, purely because the hurt and the pain is growing, they have to see to be proactive. So
Hmm.
we are hoping that by these putting out these alerts, by lobbying government, etc., that various departments of the government, the labor department, the INB department would step in and
Hmm.
start taking proactive action on these companies which have acted illegally. So that is what we are hoping.
No, you.
The big gap, however, is the following: is that a lot of the unions and associations like ours, we represent certain sections of journalists, but the actual resistance has to come from within the companies.
Correct.
I don't know whether the unions and the associations within the companies are organized or strong enough as we've gone through because
Hmm.
of years of sort of working the contract system. Many of the places which were unionized at one time are not anymore. So the collective bargaining within these companies is at a very poor level.
Right.
So if marching orders are given, there are protests on Twitter and so on. But beyond that, what?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that is where the weakness is,
Yeah.
and hopefully this kind of situation will now grow into at least people thinking of coming together as colleagues, coming together as people working in the same establishment to
Hmm.
set up some sort of internal resistance. So that's where the weakness is. There is very little internal resistance. On the social side, groups like the Mumbai Press Club or those who have gone on a PIL, etc., that hopefully will have some impact. Um,
Hmm.
but the big thing would be if there is internal resistance also.
Right. Obviously, because of this lockdown, you guys can't take out a protest march. There's nothing you can do physically. But you sit in Bombay. where, of course, many of these big newspaper managements are located. Have you had any word from them post your press statement or post this PIL? Has there been any kind of symbiotic talk between unions and managements, between press club and management, or even between government and the press club?
But the important thing, to answer your question, the important thing is that a lot of people noticed it, and we got a lot of responses,
Hmm.
both from staff and journalists as well as managements.
Hmm.
So specifically, for instance, the Sakal Group,
Yeah,
which has done a series of sackings. They've actually closed their English publication called Sakal Times.
yeah,
Got back to say that we have not sacked anybody. What
right,
they are what they're basically saying is that they've not issued termination letters. They've arm twisted them and got resignation letters out from them.
right.
So I kind of sent a message back to them saying that, look, if you want, you give us a letter stating that you've not terminated anybody, and we in counter will give you statements from at least half a dozen employees who will say that they were bullied into resigning. Are you
Hmm.
willing to take that? So we haven't heard from them after that.
Hmm.
So Sakal is one such case. Then we got a call from somebody in Forbes India saying that after they close the print side, they are not considering sacking anybody,
Hmm.
and like to make a statement to that. So I said that's very good. I mean, if you're saying that you're not going to be sacking anybody,
Hmm.
please put it in an email and send it, because then we can
Hmm.
reassure the employees that they won't suffer there.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
we've had fair amount of similar kind of responses,
Hmm.
and hopefully one specific letters which we are planning to, also specific letters to some of the companies
Hmm.
uh, that go out. I think we hope that that those letters carry the collective pressure of both civil society and journalists to
Yes.
we act as some sort of bulwark against they doing whatever they feel like. That's
Yeah.
what we are.
Yeah, but we have all noticed in many occasions in the past that whenever journalists have been sacked without notice or departments have been closed, whatever litigation has happened or whatever legal action has been taken has really resulted in very little action on the ground in terms of people being taken back or so on. So one doesn't place too much hope by that. But I suppose your point about these newspaper managements wanting sops from the government in terms of tax holiday or GST cuts or even government advertising rates being hiked. The fact that they are taking sops from the government but do not want to listen to the government which says do not sack people. I think that's the one emotional point which might have greater carry.
Yeah, so therefore we've got to also sort of also take aim at the government and say that now you stand by us.
Hmm.
If you are sort of saying that these companies should not be cutting down on people in
Hmm.
this hour of crisis,
Hmm.
then also you've got your ways of putting pressure on them. So put that and sort of act on our behalf.
Hmm.
So a lot of energy and momentum should also be dedicated to pressurizing government. There's also the Press Council of India,
Yeah.
which otherwise traditionally only is supposed to take up ethical and journalistic issues. But increasingly, Justice C.K. Prasad, who's the chairman of the Press Council, has come out increasingly in favor of defending the livelihood of journalists.
Right.
How he puts it is very interesting. He says if there is no livelihood, if there are no salaries, there are no jobs, then what journalism is there to defend?
Hmm.
So he's been pretty forthright about it. So maybe Press Council is again an institution which journalists should turn to and put pressure on government through the Press Council. So
Hmm.
these are various forums which we should be exploring. I mean, the
But
way
but
forward
why
in that.
would why would the government be interested in the case of us journalists when the government many governments lately, mostly neoliberal governments, have been very eager to push a hire and fire policy. They've consistently batted for the rights of management to sack and hire people as they wish. So why would governments want to show that kind of empathy, especially a government like this one at the center, which has generally shown a great animosity towards the media?
So good question, but the only thing probably working in our favor is that it's a very visible part of industry and business. And if the government is seen as not doing anything for an area like this, which
Hmm.
represents intellectual labor, which represents communication, which represents news, these are all important areas. And if the government is seen not doing anything in that area and that communication goes out to millions of people,
Hmm.
they really don't stand in good stead then. Then all these various appeals that they've been making
Hmm.
are meaningless. So one is just hoping that purely because of from a visibility point of view,
Yeah.
this industry is important, and therefore they would probably at least make a show of stepping in.
Yeah, yeah. One the penultimate question. I mean, with journalism kind of getting hollowed out like this, with newspapers getting rid of people at a whim, with advertising falling, with retail advertising falling in particular, I think newspapers and television stations will now be more and more beholden to government advertising, right? And
Yeah.
government has generally been a very big advertiser with the media in India, disproportionately big in terms of advertising. Will this affect journalism, you think, going forward, the situation where now newspapers will feel even more subservient to this government?
I think, on that point, uh, the sinking standards of journalism, I think we are really on a bad wicket with all that is happening. Because as it is, the government made it very clear that advertising is going to be linked to government advertising, that is going to be linked to who toes the line and who doesn't.
Right.
And let's make it very clear that for the big groups, government advertising is not much. It's maybe 15, 20%, 30% of their total kitty, most of
Hmm.
it coming from private advertising. But for the smaller groups,
Yeah.
for the thousands and thousands of small publications, small broadcasting houses, etc., government advertising is a major part of their revenue.
Hmm. Hmm.
So at the touch of a switch, if that revenue can be cut off, it's
Yeah.
very obvious that the towing the government line, which is it's not only sort of tacitly put out, but very firmly and overtly being sort of peddled,
Yeah.
that line is going to become even firmer.
Hmm.
And in that sense, independent journalism, uh, independent of government and private control, is going to become even tougher. Certainly,
Hmm.
that is going to be the situation moving forward.
It's a good thing you brought up the thousands and thousands of smaller publications, because what we have discussed in these last 40 minutes is mostly the big groups. What is the word? Have you had any word from, smaller cities and towns about smaller groups, indulging in this kind of, hire and fire and chop and change?
Um, I mean, there's somebody who's actually putting together, who's running a blog which is tracking this, and the number of shutdowns that are coming are mostly from the small groups. I mean, for instance, News Nation is not a very big group. It's laid off its entire digital team of 15 journalists.
Yeah.
Then, Nai Dunya, again,
Yeah.
is a smaller publication owned by the Dainik Jagran Group. It
Mm.
has suspended print operations on 13th April.
Mm.
So there's something else called the India Ahead News,
Yeah.
which has been documented now. They've cut salaries, sacked 50% of their staff. All that's happening. No? So you know,
No,
the, the
these of course are very Delhi, Bombay based things. I
yeah,
meant from other cities and states. Other languages.
yeah.
Are we having any word from them?
Not directly, but the crisis obviously will be greater on them,
Hmm.
and I can't sort of off the cuff tell you any specific names, but there's a lot of from Chhattisgarh, from Madhya Pradesh, from these areas, a lot of journalists are sort of phoning in and saying that there's a serious crisis. As it is, none of these staff in these smaller publications are permanent employees, or there's no, proper salary in that sense being given. But they've been just told, don't come to work. I mean, just stay at home, sort of thing.
Hmm.
So there are no, kind of legal sackings in that case, but
Hmm.
people
Hmm.
are losing their incomes from these small sources, whichever they were. So
Yeah,
so
yeah,
definitely that kind of word is coming in
yeah.
from the very small groups.
Yeah, yeah. So let me say that this is really the penultimate question. Okay, I mean, and I think this is an important question for me and for you and for all of us. Okay, sitting where you are and in the position where you are, and given your experience of this whole business for so long, what are the three things you will suggest to employees in newspapers and magazines and TV stations and even websites? What are the three things you think they should be looking out for? What are the three things, the alarm bells, to keep their so that they keep their jobs safe and their lives safe?
See, whether their job is safe or not is not their decision, unfortunately. Uh, but it is a decision which the management takes. But you see, the thing is this, that in most cases, number one, in most cases, uh, companies don't fire people in terms of actually issuing them termination letters. In most cases, they seek resignations and usually wrap it up with a year's, sorry, not a year, but a month or 2 months of notice pay, etc.
Yeah.
So, where there are bigger companies and there are contracts in place, and where there is a legal right, they should
Yes.
sort of accept these kind of baits and just fall for the resignation angle. They should stick on and try and fight it out, because then it becomes tougher for the company to sack them. Once they know they have to terminate, then it becomes more difficult and they might reconsider the decision. So that's one thing.
So you're saying don't accept, resist, stay on, and stick on,
Stay
right?
on and try and fight it out,
Yeah.
because once the company sees that that the guy is not going to just resign and walk off, then they may reconsider and they may reallot him some other position or some other department,
Right.
etc.
Right. Yeah.
So stick on and fight it out. I mean, that's the first step.
Yes.
Secondly, combine with colleagues, because this is not an individual fight.
Hmm.
So combine with colleagues, with other colleagues. This When you do something collectively, it's always, from a legal point of view, from a bargaining point of view, it becomes better. It becomes easier to fight it out. So don't sit alone. If you are suffering a certain kind of death blow, it's better that you look around you, because others are also probably getting it in the neck. So
Yeah.
combine together and take up the fight collectively. So that would be the second step. Third would be is sort of look out for the third step should be to look out for legal options, take advice, take counseling, meet and talk to people who have gone through this kind of process before, and take advice and sort of see what the options are in terms of lobbying the courts or lobbying the government, because there are various government departments which can also give notice. The labor commissioner can give notice if something illegal is being done. There are women's rights in these issues. I've seen in cases where women journalists have put up cases of being harassed from a gender point of view in these kind of situations. and notices have been issued by the Women's and Child Welfare Department on companies, and they've succeeded. So,
Hmm.
there are lots of options which can be explored. So, take good advice, reach out and try and get good counseling done on this.
Yeah, that's super.
Yeah.
Let me ask you the very last question. You have also been a very fine business journalist, a long time with the Economic Times, also with Business World. Okay, a situation like this, really, when journalists suddenly lose their jobs or do not know what the future is, they don't know where their next job is. You know, what are the two or three pieces of financial advice you could give them now, or even for journalists who are starting out, so that they don't fall into the same situation in the future? What is the financial advice? I know you're not a personal finance journalist, but still, what is the financial advice you would give to journalists? Because the Mumbai Press Club, I must remind the listeners, has also launched a pioneering insurance scheme for journalists. But on top of that, Gurbir, I was wondering two or three things you would suggest to these journalists who are on the verge of losing jobs, or perhaps in the future they might. What would you tell them in terms of securing their financial future?
Uh, you see, this is a very tough question because, in the current situation is sort of beyond, you can't fathom the depth of the, current crisis. And it's a very difficult thing to advise people financially what they can do.
Hmm.
But you mentioned one of them that is singularly been our sort of purpose, that people should be covered, especially for crisis of health and illness.
Yeah.
And a large number of journalists have actually listened to their advice, and people who are only covered for, say, a lakh and a half, 2 lakhs, have now kind of taken medical covers and insurance of up to 15 lakhs, 20 lakhs. So
Hmm.
they're not caught in a situation where they can't get medical aid for their near and dear ones. So that's a very important thing, that medical insurance, get it covered.
So
Uh,
you're talking specifically of the Mumbai Press Club
no,
scheme,
I'm
right?
saying that even
Hmm.
otherwise, I mean, I'm saying that people are realizing this so much because those who are not members of Mumbai Press Club, who've heard about it, I mean, who just know me from other cities, saying, can we join up now?
Hmm. Can
You
they
know,
do
so
so? Can they do so?
no, they can't actually,
I see.
because they have to be part of the city.
Right.
We have made a concession of not being members. We've asked even we've sort of opened it out for who are journalists who are not members of the press club. So, like there is the Mantralaya Reporters Association. Many of them wanted to join, so we've sort of opened it out, and we've got special permission for that. So we've sort of done that. But if you're not in the city, then it becomes very difficult.
Hmm.
So maybe one of the things what one could consider is bodies like the Mumbai Press Club combine with each other to launch these national insurance schemes. In fact, I'm reading that more and more journalists have sort of lobbied their own state governments to start some sort of medical insurance for those who are covering the current crisis.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
current crisis itself is a health hazard, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So some sort of specific cover for that.
Hmm.
So, so we started a accident insurance cover for 2 lakhs within the Mumbai Press Club, and especially categories like video journalists and photographers who do a lot of legwork going around the city on their bikes, etc., have come in and taken advantage of that.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
one or two cases have already got claims. I mean, people who had bike accidents, etc.
Yeah.
So this whole business of medical and health covers are very important,
Hmm.
because you don't know when tragedy strikes, and if you are out of a job at that time,
Hmm.
or you don't have a regular employment at that time, it just will kill you.
Yeah.
So medical and health insurance is a must, uh, because you can't afford normal, um, medical assistance is very, very expensive, and you don't know when things strike you. So
Hmm.
that is something which must be done.
Hmm.
Apart from that, I think there are various collectives which are sort of looking at employing journalists in freelance jobs and giving them access to all the to various projects which are sort of gray areas as far as journalism goes. They're not maybe necessarily mainline journalism, but information and communication gathering. There are a lot of people who have set up collectives for that. So maybe bodies like the Mumbai Press Club, or the Press Club of India, which is the Delhi Press Club, should probably combine and see what are the resources, which are the opportunities there. If some people are setting up funds, or they're setting up access to international organizations which are seeking information out of India and paying for that information, then we connect up to these groups and guide them. And the third thing I think which should be done is just straight individual counseling. I think if we can set up panels of senior people who take responsibility for either mentoring or guiding a few younger journalists, and just guide them through this phase, even perhaps introduce them to non-journalistic jobs for the time being, so that at least body and soul can live out this crisis, and maybe they come back to journalism a little later. So, that is also one step that could be taken.
Super. So, Gurbir, when we started off, we said we could have a chat for about 25 minutes. I think we purposely and beautifully doubled it. We've now done 56 minutes of this conversation, which has been quite fascinating. And
Absolutely.
I really thank you very much for joining me on this episode of JPod. And I hope it's been of some use to whoever is listening among journalists. But I think this is a critical moment in Indian journalism, print journalism, and I'm sure globally too, but certainly more so for us. And I thank you very much, Gurbir, for joining me. And I thank you all for listening in. Thank you so much.
Thank you, KP. Thanks for all the nice questions you posed.
Thank you so much.